Hello, thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I am David Pendergrass. At the time of this recording of the podcast, not too long ago, the United Methodist Church had a special convened meeting to vote on a bunch of issues, and one was, of course, the perennial issue and problem of whether or not you should allow same-sex couples to be married in a Methodist church, whether or not they allow same-sex or homosexual clergy, and so forth. Well, the quote-unquote traditional view won the day, and there's been all kinds of responses to it, of course, to come out. One of the little blog or essay that went out on UnitedMethodistNews.org, umnews.org, and there's an essay that went out that's got pretty popular traction on Facebook. People share it a lot. And it's called Commentary, quote, "Be Careful Using the Bible" by the Reverend James R. McCormick from Cumming, Georgia. And he is retired. James McCormick is a retired Methodist minister. I don't know how long he served, but for a long time. I read his essay, and I thought that there were portions of it with which I concur, and other parts I thought were just really uninformed and bad. And it demonstrates again how very unfortunate it is that people online don't know the difference and of these certain issues. And I'll talk about them as we go along. I waited a while to record this podcast because I was really worked up a little when I first read it, because I was very frustrated that this kind of stuff goes around. I was very frustrated this guy was a pastor for all those years and probably influenced a lot of people in his ministry and his interpretation. And he might be just as upset about me and my interpretation, but at least I'll tell you why. And I'm convinced my way is more biblically accurate and more historically accurate than his. So what I'll do is I'll read it, portions of it, and then I'll pause and reflect on it with you. It's not that long of an article. He says, quote, "One must be careful in using the Bible as a source of moral standards. Throughout history, the Bible has too often been used to justify one's own moral preferences rather than to seek God's will about human behavior. The Bible has been quoted to support slavery and segregation. The Bible continues to be used to oppose women's work outside the home and female ordination." We pause there and say, right off the bat is, I agree. We do need to be careful when it comes to using the Bible as a source of moral standards. Yep, but being careful doesn't mean it's not there, but we should be careful. And he's right that the Bible has been used to justify one's own moral preferences. My first thought was, of course, I agree with that. My second is, it also means, probably, that this man, Reverend McCormick, will also use the Bible to support his own moral preferences. So the fact is, if it's too often used, my question is going to be throughout the essay is it true for the author as well? Is it true for the author that your own moral preference, instead of seeking God's will about human behavior, stands out? And we'll see. My view is absolutely that's what happens. The very thing he critiques other is exactly what he does himself. When he says the Bible's it's supported slavery and segregation, imposed women's work, my response is it has been. And okay, so just because it has been, we'll see what his point is, but it has been. So we're going to be careful about how to use it and so forth. He goes on, quote, "Others quote the same Bible to oppose slavery and segregation and to affirm women's rights as equal to men's. In studying the Bible, it is necessary to realize that often God is cited as supporting whatever values are normative at that time in history. Those are, quote, timely, end quote, standards. Standards valued for a time, but not necessarily, quote, timeless standards that are applicable for all time and all circumstances. End quote." Let me pause there. He can say it that way. It's fine. I don't, and I don't prefer the way he said it at all. I think what makes clarity is, I think what he's trying to say is that God is cited as supporting values as normative at the time, the timely and all that timeless stuff. The way I say it is, the Bible has all kinds of moral commandments, prohibitions and prohibitions. The question is, are all the moral commandments, are they morally binding only in a context in which they were stated, or are they morally binding on any other people group? And that's the question. They might be morally binding for a people group in the ancient world and morally binding and timelessly. They might be morally binding for a people group and not morally binding for any other people group ever in history. So there's a lot of different variations on this. But that's why the question for me should be, is a moral commandment in the Bible Is it morally binding on me today in the modern Western world? That's the question. And so we'll go on from there. Quote, he says, remember that the Bible affirms Abraham having sexual relations with Hagar, Sarah's maid, in order to produce his first son Ishmael. Let me pause there for a second. When it says the Bible affirms, I don't know what he means by that. What he should have said is, the biblical author writes, at least one author, if not several editors, wrote a story that described how Abraham had sex with Hagar. And if you go read Genesis chapter 16, where the story is told, it never says or implies that God said that Abraham should have sex with Hagar. In fact, Sarah, Abraham's wife, is the one who told Abraham, go have sex with Hagar since I can't have a baby. So when it says that the Bible affirms it, no, it doesn't. The Bible, the Protestant Bible alone, is 66 books of the canon. The Bible doesn't affirm it. The narrative in Genesis chapter 16 describes where Sarah told Abraham to go sleep with her maidservant to have a baby. So right off the bat, it tells me that James McCormick is not trying to be real clear about exactly what the text says. The second thing it tells me is, probably, I know what he's relating because it's a very common argument, is that if something appears in the biblical narrative, it therefore is affirmed by, quote, the Bible. That's absolutely false. It's false. Just because something appears in a narrative, an event that happens, it doesn't mean we should go do you likewise. I really hope this reverend didn't teach his people to read the Bible that way. I really hope he didn't. That is very dangerous and frankly stupid. Just because someone raped someone in the Bible doesn't mean you should go do it too. Just because someone had a bunch of wives doesn't mean we should go do it too. It is not Aesop's fables where the moral of the story is go do blank or don't do blank. I've talked about this a whole lot in other podcasts. I've done a whole series based off the book How to Read the Bible for What It's Worth, which is a good summary of how scholars read this. But that's not historically how Christians read the Bible. You're not supposed to read every single narrative as, quote, affirmed by the Bible just because it's a story in the Bible. Human characters are flawed sinners throughout the Bible. So we don't read the narratives and say, go do you likewise. Anyway, the Bible does not affirm that Abraham should have had sex. That's not what it does. Go back, quote, only later did Sarah produce Isaac, or Yitzhak, through whom Jews trace their ancestry. Remember King Solomon's legendary 1,000 wives and concubines? Today, we would call Abraham's and Solomon's sexual actions adultery and not condone such actions for the behavior of others. Let me pause there for a second. Yes, King Solomon apparently did have a lot of wives and concubines. The Bible never, ever praises that. Ever. It never, that I know of, explicitly condemns it. In the New Testament, and even throughout early Jewish history, certainly by the time of the New Testament, Jesus affirms monogamy. One man and one woman. Yes, that's right. But when you say today we would call his adultery, it makes no sense to jump from what Solomon did to, quote, today. And I don't know what that means by today. Does it mean the Western world? Does it mean modern Christians? And so forth. The first question is, did an ancient Jewish person think it was adultery for Solomon to have multiple wives and concubines? The answer is absolutely no. Because ancient Jews believed adultery was when you had sex with another man's wife. Not with another woman, with another man's wife. So the wives and concubines that went with Solomon didn't have other husbands. Solomon was their only husband. They would not call that adultery. Jesus himself almost certainly would not have called it adultery either. Though what Jesus called people to was what God's original design was, which was man and woman alone, not one man with more than one wife. So it's irrelevant. So that analogy or disanalogy he's trying to bring up doesn't match. It doesn't work. Abraham's action as adultery also doesn't work. In the ancient world, that would absolutely not have been considered adultery because Hagar was not married to another man. It wasn't. So again, we need to read the biblical text in its historical context before we condemn the biblical text as the implication is backwoods, stupid, prehistoric, whatever stuff. But now we are the enlightened ones. Granted, modern American people might think that it is adultery whether you have sex with any other person altogether. Okay, but first let's hear what the text said as it said it, and not lay upon the ancient text something that was never there. Because then what happens is you say, oh, now it was good to have adultery back then, but now we don't think it's bad to have adultery. No, the question is the definition of adultery. Every culture concurs, I shouldn't say everyone which I've ever read and ever studied ever concurs, adultery is wrong. The question is, what are the parameters? What defines adultery? And I don't care, frankly, what ancient Jews thought 3,500, 4,000 years ago. What I care about is what Jesus taught. Jesus taught that we should be married man and woman, period. So, but he didn't redefine the definition of adultery. Jesus didn't. Not in the Gospels. If he did, we don't have it recorded. Hey, let me take a quick break. Please listen carefully to these quick announcements. I'll be right back.
Do you know of any skeptics in your family, at work, or among your friends? Do you struggle with questions concerning the existence of God or the truth claims of Christianity? Has a skeptic ever challenged you with a difficult question concerning your faith? Then you need to buy Dr. Pendergrass's book, A Skeptic Challenges a Christian, on Amazon.com. You can get it in paperback or on Kindle or in audiobook form to listen to. A Skeptic Challenges a Christian is written unlike any other book. It's not boring and full of technical jargon. It reads like you're sitting down having a conversation. As one reviewer said, as a college student, I absolutely love this book. Dr. Pendergrass knows how to effectively answer a lot of the questions that my friends at school ask about my faith. This book is a great resource for theological debates and for my own personal growth. The arguments are clear and understandable. I would definitely recommend this book to anyone who has questions about Christianity, wants to learn how to defend their faith, or even just wants a good read. Great book. Find out why it has a perfect 5-star rating on Amazon.com. A Skeptic Challenges a Christian. Buy your copies today. Ever wonder what God wants you to do with your money? Should I give it all away or save? What did the early church do with their money? In Dr. Pendergrass's book, Give It Away, Reflections on How Christians Use Money, you'll get 4 short, powerful lessons on what to do with money based on some key texts from the New Testament. This is a wonderful guide for study and reflection. It even comes with reflection questions that are perfect for small group discussions. Give It Away, Reflections on How Christians Use Money. Buy your copies today on Amazon.com. Do you like receiving a glimpse of the kingdom for free? Would you like to support what God is doing through these resources? Then please consider donating to David Pendergrass Ministries, Inc. today at davidpendergrass.com. There, you can also sign up to receive Dr. Pendergrass's free blog on a wide range of theological, biblical, and relationship issues. That's davidpendergrass.com.
We'll go back to what he said. So back to McCormick, quote, "Remember that, in ancient Israel, eating shellfish and wearing clothing of 2 different fabrics at the same time were called, quote, abominations. Walking too many paces on the Sabbath was considered sinful, and it was permissible to make slaves of captured enemies. So much of what was considered sinful or acceptable was simply the norms or standards that were practiced by the majority of the people, but condemned today." We end the quote there. This is all over the place. The first part, in ancient Israel, you're right, eating shellfish and clothing and a whole bunch of things was to consider off limits. Absolutely. My question is, Reverend James, what conceivable difference does that make? If you mean today, modern Christians don't consider eating shellfish abomination, fine. We'll go there in a little bit because he's going to say more about that. But that has nothing to do with our modern, enlightened, super smart, changing cultural views. And if that's what he thinks at all, he's absolutely out of place for 2,000 years of historic Christianity. Christians have not decided what is moral just because we are older than the Bible is. That's not how it was decided. It's not how it's decided today. It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing that this guy is a reverend who probably got his undergrad and master's degree at a school and would say this and not realize how embarrassing this is. This is what atheists should say are non-believers, not believers. And I'm going to come back a little bit to that because that's a big one. When he says the last part of it here, so much of what was considered sinful or acceptable is simply the norms or standards that were practiced by the majority of people but condemned today. That just doesn't make any sense. But condemned today, it doesn't make any sense. If he means there are things, this sentence just doesn't make any sense. I don't want to say it doesn't make any sense. Things that were considered sinful or acceptable were the norms or standards. A sinful behavior is not a norm or a standard. If you mean in the ancient world, it was common to articulate certain behaviors as sinful, and they were just part of those cultural norms of a society, to that I would say on some things, yes, but not within the Jewish covenantal stipulations. He is showing overwhelming ignorance if he thinks the average ancient person thought it was sinful to walk on the Sabbath. That's nonsense. Ancient people didn't have Shabbat. That was a Jewish holiday. And these other things like wearing 2 cloths of fabric and shellfish, these things were to demonstrate that Jews were not supposed to mix between cultures. You're hard-pressed to find too many things within the Levitical stipulations through Leviticus and the Mosaic Law and Exodus and Deuteronomy that fit the ancient Canaanites or Egyptians and Mesopotamian cultures. Once again, you need to know the historical context. When Jews thought they were in a very particular covenant agreement with the God of the universe, it involved very particular covenant stipulations. And if you think, this guy or you listener, if you think that everybody in the ancient world had the same old norms, then you do not know anything about the ancient world. You need to go read scholars in the field to see how wrong that is. The Jews did have some values in life, some ethical norms that were similar, absolutely. They had some prohibitions that were similar, absolutely. But when he says so much of what was considered, the evidence is against him, that's demonstrably false. The other thing I'd say to that is, sinful behaviors back then wouldn't be condemned today. If it was a sin for an ancient Jew to put 2 different kinds of fabrics together, and again, how much that really was a violation, we don't know. We know it's part of the Levitical code, almost certainly to demonstrate not mixing with cultures. It's a metaphor. We don't condemn that today. He said, but we condemn it today. That doesn't make any sense. Who in the church condemns mixing fabric? Who in the church, that sentence makes no sense. I think the whole point, if I'm being as fair as I can, I think what he's saying is, back then, their values were purely dictated by the ancient milieu or the ancient cultural mindset of their neighbors. But today, things are all different. If that's what he means, that's a common argument. He's just flat out mistaken. He's completely wrong. That is not true. Okay, back to quoting him. He said, sadly, that practice has not changed. I don't know what the practice is, but okay. As a child, I was not allowed to have playing cards in our house. Dancing and even going to the movies were frowned upon, and drinking alcoholic beverages was not allowed. I was told that Jesus and his disciples drank only grape juice! Today, all of those things are permissible even by religious people, showing that moral standards do evolve. I remember the insightful words of James Russell Lowell, quote, "New occasions teach new duties. Time makes ancient good uncouth. They must upward still and onward who would keep abreast of truth." End quote. Okay, let me say a few things about that. The last end quote is completely irrelevant. New occasions teaching new duties. Perhaps a moral duty is not the same as a moral value or a moral standard. This is where, again, he's confused and needs to take a basic class on morality and ethics in a master's level class. And this idea of, when he says, he's quoting James Lowell, they must upward still and onward who keep abreast of truth. That is, you keep on progressing. If that means you think moral values incessantly progress every year or 2 year, whatever it is, that's nonsense. That's demonstrably false. If you mean by that civilization of the last 5,000 years has developed certain moral values or discovered certain moral values, I agree with that. Moral duties, of course, change depending on the situation. Moral duties are not the same as moral values. And what he means are moral values, that's what he said, or moral standards. And the examples he gave, secondly, about playing cards and dancing and going to the movies and drinking alcoholic beverages, he says, They are permissible even by religious people. My response to that is some people don't allow those things. I've met people to this day, particularly more in Pentecostal traditions. I know Latino. I have a lot of Latino friends with Mexican parents, and well, some are Cuban and so forth, but a lot of Mexican parents. And to this day, they still disallow youth from going to the movies. They're convinced if you go to the movies, you have sex. The point is, in all these issues, for my first response is he should have nuanced that. Every single religious person does not concur with these things are permissible. But why is it? Why were these old folks were they just stupid? Were they just rigorous legalists? Maybe they were all stupid. Maybe they're legalist. That's not what I've read, and that's not what I've experienced from people who actually did disallow those things. What they would say is, it's not the cards that's bad. For a long time in American culture, playing cards and dancing was associated with saloons and bars and sex. And having sex with strangers and partying, and what other old word we don't use anymore because it's America, and that's carousing. Those are specific sins listed in the vice list in the New Testament. So if you give a slightest bit of benefit of the doubt, the reason why those things were condemned is because they were associated with sexual immorality, and that sometimes translated a party spirit or carousing or being what today probably in my mind the very best analogy of what they mean by that is a partier in a fraternity house. That whole mindset of living for the weekend to get drunk and partying and sex, that's precisely what the New Testament condemns multiple times. Authors of the New Testament. And playing cards and dancing for a long time was associated just with that. That's why they're condemning it. That moral value, I sure hope he doesn't think is now good. Now it's good. Now it's good to get drunk and have sex with people you barely know. Now, because we've all grown up, David. Everything's are different now. All he's changing, what's changed is not the moral standard, but what we call etiquette. The moral duties in the situation have changed because we've defined it differently on the context. That's fine. Drinking alcoholic beverages and going to the movies, that depends again on the context, what they're really trying to avoid in the situation. When he said, I was told that Jesus and the disciples drank only grape juice, well, then you were lied to. You were lied to. But you were lied to by people probably because the people were teetotalers, that is, they were against alcohol altogether. And the reason why most people were teetotalers, if you do any kind of research on this for a long time in American culture, is because a large proportion of the United States of America were alcoholics. They were raging alcoholics. Children, adults, they had alcohol from breakfast, lunch, noon, dinner, or whatever. And that's why the prohibition began with women. Women, moms and wives, went to bars, saloons, and literally crashed them. They threw things through glass, took bars and beat the snot out of them because they represented their entire family was about to die. They were absolutely addicted to alcohol. It was a national crisis, and that's why the government eventually voted for the prohibition. So the reason why this pendulum went so far to say Jesus could not have drank wine is because they were associating with wine with the alcoholics and addicts and people who were abusing it. Again, just read history on that. They also lied to him. I wouldn't lie to him. I don't lie to my own children. I never told my kids. I myself, I don't drink. I've never drank alcohol in my life. But I don't tell people. I don't even tell my children. Drinking alcohol is not a sin. Jesus drank wine. It can't be a sin if Jesus did it. Now, the wine he drank typically was probably more like a 3/5 alcohol content, but never a lot. There would have been alcohol in it. So it can't be inherently evil. But I explain why I don't drink. And I explain where you can be a Christian and drink. I don't lie to them and say Jesus drank grape juice. That's because I nuance. But a lot of parents don't nuance. Okay. Does that mean the moral standard of not getting drunk is now changed? If so, you need to erase all the parts of the New Testament where it says, don't get drunk. Drunkards will not enter the kingdom of God. You have to erase all of them. And I'm not prepared to do that. So all these examples so far are bad examples of his understanding of ethics, his understanding of historical context, his understanding of hermeneutics, that is how to apply it today. So far, these are all bad, and I know where he's leading, and that's, of course, to the gay issue. Let's talk about that. So, here we go. Okay, so he's about to talk about the gay issue. Here he goes, quote, "That brings us to a question sharply dividing the Christian community in our time. How are we to think about and act toward the LGBTQ community? We know that the majority of Americans do not oppose homosexual relations, yet others believe that while every person is a child of God, homosexual behavior is a choice and is sinful, and marriage is only to be affirmed when between a man and a woman. A key question for me is that position simply an expression of ancient and current cultural norms, or is that the timeless moral position sanctioned by God? End quote. I have a couple of responses. I agree that it is a question that sharply divides the Christian community. I completely agree with them. The issue of to think about and act toward the community, and I'll be more specific. How are we to treat and behave toward those who practice homosexuality? But in general, I agree with that. However, when he says, we know that the majority of Americans do not oppose, my response immediately is, brother, I don't give a rip. I couldn't care less if a majority of Americans thought anything about anything. I don't give a rip. Who cares? Who cares? Who cares what a majority of Russians think, or Puerto Ricans think, or Canadians think? Who gives a rip? The church is not America. I can't believe that. If he said we know that the majority of baptized Christians, based on these statistics, okay, then that's it, but that's still a statistic. It doesn't mean it's right or wrong, but at least we're now in context. Who gives a rip what Americans think? Have you met an American? I mean, they're a bunch of pagans. They're a bunch of materialistic, alcoholic, addict, narcissist, entitled. I mean, and it's crept in the church. What difference does it make what Americans think? So that part, sorry to get worked up, but I couldn't believe it. Of all the things. Anyway, I do agree that it's a divisive issue, but in this last question, I just don't understand what it means. Is it an expression of ancient and current cultural norms? I don't know what that means. Or is it a timeless moral position sanctioned by God? Again, if my way I would say is it still morally binding God's view of sexuality? Is what God viewed of sexuality throughout the entire history of Judaism and Christianity still applicable today? And this is extremely important to understand. I've said this many times in podcasts and in blogs too. There aren't many moral commandments that are consistent from the Old Testament to the New Testament. There are several, but there aren't tons of them because, and I'll talk about this, because of the major shift between the Mosaic Law to the covenant through Jesus. What is absolutely consistent, without a shred of ambiguity, is God's view of sexuality. For thousands of years, in every single piece of Jewish literature we possess, and I mean every one of them, Old Testament, Josephus, Philo, all the what we call the pseudepigrapha, tons of literature Jews wrote. Every single time sexuality is mentioned, ever, it affirms heterosexual marriages, and if homosexuality or same-sex is ever mentioned, it's condemned as horribly vile. At no time in the history of Judaism ever is homosexual practice neutral or approved. Secondly, at no point in the history of Christianity, in any kind of Christian document before the last few decades, has it been different from what Jews have always believed as well. Ever. 0% ambiguity. So the question then is it morally binding what they have said and thought for thousands of years, and all of a sudden it's different, or not? And I think that's a very good question. I mean that. I think it's a very good question, because just because it's been around for 5,000 years doesn't mean it's true for today. But if it is not true for today, I need some really good, compelling reasons to change thousands of years of church tradition. Let's see what he says in his examples. So see if he persuades me. Quote, think about this. The writers of the Bible did not know about germs. That's why some thought that when a person became sick, they were possessed by demons. Today, almost all people of faith understand germs and infections, and they treat such conditions with antibiotics such as penicillin. The writers of the Bible also do not know about genetics, but we do. We understand that we do not choose the color of our eyes, the texture of our hair, or the pigment of our skin. Likewise, most scientists and psychologists of today believe that same gender orientation is not a matter of choice. Let me pause there. I'll concede that. I'll concede that the ancient world, they didn't know about germs. I'll concede that. I'll concede those things. And so far, fine. And most scientists, psychologists believe that same-sex orientation is not a matter of choice. I'll concede all that for the point where it's going. And I won't tell you where I know he's going, but I'll pause. Okay, quote, let's go a bit deeper into the issue of morality. How do we distinguish between values that are timely, those that are affirmed as norms by the majority of people at one time in history, but are changed or updated in another generation because of new understandings, and the values that are timeless and applicable in all situations and at all times in history? What is an eternal value? Here's where the Bible, taken as a whole and seen in its depths, can guide us. Let me pause there. This is where I think I kind of agree, and at the same time, I would never articulate almost anything he said this way. These moral values are timely. He means moral values and moral duties. The moral value is something like an abstract thing, like honesty. Does the Bible support being honest? And if it does, is it good now to lie? Or is it still good to be honest? That's a moral value. A moral duty is it always the right thing to do to tell the truth no matter the circumstance? That's different. There are times that a person might argue it's better to lie to a person who says, I'm going to go kill your family, tell where they are, and you lie to them, than it is to tell the truth. But again, I did a whole series on my YouTube page. I've got I think it's 5-part series on morality, and I explain all of this. If you have not explored morality, if you've never been exposed to any scholarship on it ever, I give the best I can an introduction in only five easy payments on morality and how to understand the distinctions here. Okay, that really much matters. So here he does not do a good job of distinguishing these at all. The second thing he doesn't get distinction is he says that are timely, those that are affirmed as norms by the majority of people at one time in history. My response there is it doesn't matter if a majority of people consider it a particular moral value. That doesn't make it timely. You don't take a vote for morality. That's not how ethics works. You don't raise your hand. It's not how it works. The majority of the Jewish teachers for which we have evidence in the ancient world believed certain moral norms. Yeah, that doesn't mean all Jews of the time period always thought that. And even if 100% of the ancient Jews believed it was a sin to tie certain leathers together or whatever it is, just because history has changed and now we're quote unquote another generation, that's not how morality, we don't decide to change it because we're a newer generation. That's not how it works. And I'll go there I'll say more in a second. That's not how it works. He goes on, quote, at creation, it is clear that human beings were the ultimate purpose of creation. And then he quotes Psalm 8, created a little less than God and crowned with glory and honor. End quote for a second. My response is, where is that clear? Where is it clear that at creation, human beings were the ultimate purpose of creation? Maybe they were. How is that clear? And when you mean at creation, Genesis 1:1 has nothing to do with humans. Scholars often argue that the point of creation, in fact, is not humans as the ultimate purpose. The ultimate purpose for creation itself, some might argue, is that creation itself serves as a place for God's presence to dwell, for God's kingdom to rule. That is, creation itself is a medium for God's rule to be established. He is the ultimate purpose of creation. And that humans and all creatures and animals of all kind of sort can participate in his rule. That kind of sounds like what Jesus said, that he's come to preach about the rule of God. But nevertheless, I usually hate when people use the word it's clear unless it really is clear and you've got tons of Bible verses to back it up. And he has none. He talks about creation, then quotes from Psalm 8. And Psalm 8, created a little less than God and crowned with glory and honor, has nothing to do. Psalm 8 has nothing to do with human beings being the, quote, ultimate purpose of creation. Anyway, go back, quote, we have been created in the image of God, called into being by God, breathing his spirit into us. That's all of the Bible is about how we are to be in a right relationship with God, and that relationship with God being expressed in a right relationship with ourselves and with others. End quote. I will concede that. Quote, second only to God, humans are the most important entities in existence. Pause. End quote. Why in the world would you say that? What possible evidence do you have that humans are the most important entities in existence? The Bible doesn't say that. Just because we were created in God's image, according to in Genesis, does not mean we're the second most important entities in existence. When the psalmists say you create us a little bit lower than the angels, if you take that as a literal ontological thing, great. That means we're better than the angels. But that doesn't mean we're second place. We don't know all of the beings God has created in the universe. We don't know that. How could you possibly rank it? There might be aliens on some other planet that are much, much more higher in God's love list. We just don't know. What we know is what we know. And the Bible never says we're the second most important entities in existence. And if it is, show me where in Scripture that is. I don't know where you could ever get that idea from. But okay, back to the quote. Quote, therefore, what is moral in a timeless sense is whatever is helpful to human beings, and whatever is immoral, he says, and what is immoral is whatever is hurtful to human beings. That is a timeless value. It cuts across all times and circumstances. It helps us separate temporary customs from values that are lasting. End quote. And this is exactly where I knew he was going to go when I read it, and this is exactly what I'm so overwhelmingly disappointed and embarrassed by. This is nonsense. It is nonsense. Number one, the Bible never says we're the second most important entities. Two, you can't move, even if it were, even if we were that, you can't move from that to therefore the moral value that's timeless is anything that doesn't hurt us. That's just sheer nonsense. That's just sheer nonsense. What that is good, grade A pagan mindset. That's what pagans think. And I've done podcasts on this before. This is that oldie but goodie, at least in our modern culture. And that is, as long as it's not hurting anybody, then it's okay to do. But if it hurts someone, then it's not okay to do. That's just stupid. I went to the dentist the other day, and it hurt a lot. My dentist did nothing wrong to me. I'm not the second most important entity in the world in creation, and the dentist hurt me. Therefore, and that's what you would have to believe if this is a timeless value, whatever that means that it would mean that. He means it's a moral imperative. It's morally binding that every single time you hurt a human being, you've just sinned. You see how stupid that is? I've spanked my children. I was spanked. It hurt their bottom. I didn't sin by spanking them. The dentist didn't sin. My chiropractor doesn't sin when he cracks my back. I mean, on and on examples it gives. We can give tons of examples where human beings hurt other human beings, and it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do. There are multiple biblical verses that speak about God causing harm or suffering that is redemptive. It's good. It's for discipline. I could go down a long list, and I won't now because I have another podcast and blogs about suffering. This is abject nonsense. And then I'll bring up what I've been alluding to a long time, say I'll get to it later. In the New Testament, what they did not do is, this is so important. I've said this many times, and it's so worth repeating. This kind of nonsense is out there everywhere, and it's so frustrating because the New Testament is there. It should be our guide of how to do it. At least it seems to me. You pick someone else, I'm not going to find it convincing. I think the New Testament should be our guide. The earliest Christians should be our guide on what to do with the Old Testament. What nobody said in the New Testament era is, hey man, it's a new generation. It's a new generation. Just times where they are changing. Those old fogies, my grandparents didn't know what the crap they were talking about. They never said that. The changing factor on what was morally binding was Jesus, for crying out loud. Jesus never called people back to Levitical codes. Jesus never asked people to be a really good religious observant Jew and make sure they never violated everything Moses commanded at the temple. In fact, he critiqued the temple. He judged the temple. The earliest Christians were adamant about this. There was a massive council, and it is massive, meaning massive in importance, for which we have direct evidence, people who were there, eyewitness testimony, in Acts chapter 15. When these Gentiles had to be converted to Christianity, and the question was, do they need to have the Mosaic law forced upon them or not? And the answer was, no, they do not. What they did not say was, come on now, stupid. That's with our parents' generation. That's not all timeless. What's really timeless, as long as it doesn't hurt them. Just tell those new converts, just don't hurt anybody, and that's okay. I can't believe how bad this nonsense is that he just said. And this is what's preached and promulgated all over the place. Why can't Jesus be good enough? Why can't what he said be good enough? Why can't what the early Christians did be good enough? Why do we have to make up new things? Why make up new ways to interpret morally binding things? Why can't their guide be enough for us? The only thing I can fathom is this post-enlightenment, and this has been so infectious to our modern Western mindset, including people in the church, that everything post the Enlightenment is everything that's more up to date is better. Anything that's old is stupid and passé, and anything that's new is better. That's just so demonstrably false and stupid. It's just stupid. You're older now, and hopefully wiser, having listened to this very podcast. But are you more stupid than you were 10 minutes ago? 10 minutes ago, were you more stupid? This is ridiculous. Were you less intelligent? Maybe you've learned something. You've gained more knowledge, but are you really more smarter? No, your knowledge might have increased. What about 2 days ago, a week ago, 5 years, 10 years ago? Do we really think all ancient people didn't know anything wise that should be kept on for a long time just because we're newer? Not to mention what happens in 50 years. The things we think are so awesome and cool right now, it'll be stupid later on. I would do this. I would time travel 100 years, 50 years, 10 years, and I'd read this article and say, this dummy, he read this and said, we're the second most important entities in existence, and what's timeless as long as it don't hurt anybody. That was stupid. That's so 10 years ago. That's so 10 years ago. Now we know it's different. Now we know what's good is to go kill everybody. Now we know it's good. You see, it's just a profound kind of relativism that doesn't make any sense. So it's against the Bible. There is no reason to believe whatsoever, and it doesn't make sense. I'd say those are bad things. Those are bad things. So, again, if you listen to my podcast often, sorry to the repeat, but if not, this will be first for you. Historically, typically, okay, let me say it this way. The earliest Christians, all the way in the earliest Christian, I already told you some in the New Testament. When the temple fell in AD 70, especially, things changed for the worse as well. When it came to following Mosaic regulations, there was no more temple. And what happened in documents like the letter of Barnabas, it's the close of the first century. They were already interpreting huge chunks of the Old Testament moral prohibitions as allegorical. They would dismiss big chunks of it because they didn't apply anymore. We're not ancient Jews living in Mosaic covenant, so I'm not going to live like that. Well, it's authoritative, but it's not morally commanding. It's authoritative, but it's not morally binding. If that don't make any sense to you, think of it this way. If my children are chatting one day, and I overhear the you overhear the conversation. They say, "Dad said for you to go clean up your room." And I go, "Okay." And then Hayden says to Joey, "Well, who did he say it to?" And Joey said, "Me." He goes, "Okay." And then I interview him, "Hayden and Joey, what are you doing right now?" And Joey says, "I'm about to go clean up my room." And I go, "Why is that?" She said, "Well, my dad said to." I go, "Hayden, what about you?" He goes, "No, I'm not going to." So wait a second, Hayden. You don't think your dad's authoritative? He goes, "Oh, he's absolutely authoritative. Whatever he says is authoritative. But everything he said is not morally binding to all of us at all times." But in the office of dad and father, he is always equally authoritative. Or in the military, a commanding officer gives orders all the time. Major Bob says, "Go take that gun and go over there on that hill." And Major Bob tells the other person, "Don't do anything." The other person says, "Go clean the latrine." Or other times he's just silent. Every single time he says anything whatsoever, every single soldier is supposed to be listening because everything out of his mouth is authoritative because he's in the office of commanding officer. But not everything is morally binding. It depends on who he's talking to. Well, in the early church, it's the exact same way. When we read the New Testament, it's the exact same way. Every single thing Jesus said, everything we find, I'll be even broader. Everything a biblical author says is authoritative for the Christian. The biblical authors are commanding officers, particularly on the things they're trying to affirm, like who God is and what he wants and how to live life. It's always equally authoritative. Of course it is. It's not all equally binding. The ancient Jews didn't think everything was morally binding at all times. Jesus did not think everything was morally binding at all times. The early church did not think everything was morally binding at all times. They weren't idiots. They knew that some things only applied to certain situations. The early church took what Jesus taught as the number one authority there was. Period. It trumped everything. It trumped Moses, trumped everybody. And if Jesus and the early church did not affirm it, something in the Old Testament, or restate it, in general, they didn't live by it. So if you want to know what was morally binding, did Jesus say it? 2, did the early church say it? 3, did they restate something in the Old Testament? But you really can stop at the first two things. Did Jesus say it? Or two, did the early church say it? That's it. Those are the things that became morally binding. Now, you can find early church fathers who cite from the Old Testament, fine. But in general, historically, in Orthodox tradition, and certainly the vast majority of Christian thinkers today, and I'm one of them, that's exactly what most people in the church have historically done. Jesus and the early church, because of the Jesus event, not because times have changed, but because of what Jesus means and what he meant. Which means today, there are no new moral values unless Jesus gives them. So what it means is the church today across the world would have to come to consensus that the risen Jesus has given us a new moral value and or a new moral duty. That he has given us something new. He's either changed his mind on something or it's something brand new. For example, if the church came about and said, you know what, the Spirit has been speaking to us in Spanish and English and Chinese and African, whatever it is, and he says, the moral value now is, it is a really, really good thing to face north. And we feel that God is telling us the moral duty is that whenever we see someone who's facing any other direction, we should turn them so they face north too. That's our moral duty. When we see anybody in the parking lot, the grocery store, at home, or whatever, we should do our best to point them north. The moral value, always face north. The moral duty is try to force other one to face north. And we don't have to believe that risen Jesus has told us that. If and until that time happens, we're not calling that a moral value or moral duty. Let me say the opposite. We have no moral value and duty. Now it is no longer a moral value to remain married. So we no longer have the moral duty to stay married, except for in rare emergency situations. And we'd all have to believe in the church of the resurrected Jesus, that his Holy Spirit has now told us he changed his mind. It's now okay to get divorced. It doesn't really matter why you do it at all. And you don't have to stay married. But that's what it would take. That's what it would take. It would take the church around the world to tell us that's the case. We'd have to all come to agreement before we changed. Otherwise, there is no moral value and no moral duty. Otherwise, there is no new good thing that used to be bad. We go to Jesus or to the church, period. Okay. Because of that, all he's saying here about whatever is hurtful to humans is bad is just nonsense. It's not Christian, it's not biblical, and it's embarrassing that a minister would say this. Okay, I'm going to wrap up there today, part 1, and I really hope you'll listen to part 2, which will come out really soon, and we'll pick back up there. Well, the conversation isn't finished. You can always reach out to me on social media. Are you on Facebook? I am too. At Glimpse of the Kingdom. Glimpse of the Kingdom on Facebook. Be sure to like it, and you can see updates there. Also, if you're on Twitter, check me out at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass, or at Glimpse the King, at Glimpse the King, and I try my best to respond to comments and questions on there as quickly as I can. If you want more, there are many more resources on the podcast and my blog. Go to my website, davidpendergrass.com, and you can see a full list of the podcast, and my blog is available for free. Are you active in a church right now? I'd be happy to come out to your church and do all kinds of classes and workshops there. Check out davidpendergrass.com, davidpendergrass.com for more information. And may God in his great grace give you even just a glimpse of his kingdom this week. See you next time.